This is a quick little warning. If you haven't seen this episode yet, I would recommend you watch it first and then come back. And if you don't do that, just be okay with the fact that I'm gonna spoil basically the entire story of the episode in this review. Hello there. My name is Cademan, and I am the creator of the animations that you'll find on this YouTube channel. I wrote them and I animated them myself. And there's many things that inspired me to end up being a creator and a writer. There's lots of stories that I simply just fell in love with growing up. And I thought to myself, hey, I'm going to make stories like that to show other people one day. But one of those things that was a huge inspiration to me was the show Star Trek Next Generation. So what I'm gonna do today is I am going to do a little review of the pilot episode of Star Trek Next Generation. Picard walks out of the shadows. He's walking around the engineering of the starship, which is a very cool set. They're like, we want to show off our very cool set. But he talks about how he was assigned to this new ship, the Enterprise, and he's sent to look into this Farpoint station place, and he still has an incomplete crew because some of them will be joining up with him at Farpoint Station, most notably his first officer. Now, as Picard is on the bridge and he's talking to Data about investigating the Farpoint Station, Troy senses a powerful mind, which both tells us that Troy has an amount of psychic powers, but also serves to introduce the villain of this story, Q. Q creates this force field around the ship, and Q tells Picard that they have to go back to their solar system because humanity has spread far enough. Now, this is a little weird. I don't know why Q's telling them to do that, but maybe he's trying to prevent the Enterprise's mission from, seeking out even further than they've been thus far. I don't know. I don't entirely get why Q is starting by saying you have to go back. Now, what happens next is Picard very politely asks Q what he is, and this shows the polite nature of our captain, where he wants to try and reason with alien races before he goes to violence, which is demonstrated a number of times in this episode of how Picard interacts with Q. So Q turns himself into a military boy, and Picard replies by, "That nonsense is far behind us," which shows the optimism and pacifism, which is a big part of the Star Trek franchise. Now, this philosophy of the perfect future that's beyond war is both the best and worst part of the Star Trek franchise, because on the one hand, it's nice to see a future that's not terrible, but on the other hand, it can read as being unrealistic and also at times inconsistent of how advanced and how perfect this perfect future actually is. Now, at this point, Q and Picard start to argue about how much progress humanity has made. Now, this is a great philosophical beat for the first episode, demonstrating the philosophical nature of the show. Q represents the pessimist that believes humanity is more evil than it is good, and the universe would be better off without humanity. And Picard represents the optimist that says we're getting better every day, and look at how far we've come, although he admits that sometimes humanity gets it wrong and does the wrong thing. Picard accuses Q of not being willing to learn, but instead ready to pass judgment on humanity simply because he doesn't understand them. Another moment that shows the deep philosophy of the Star Trek franchise. The idea of Star Trek is, look at how much we could accomplish if we all stopped fighting and came together, which fits quite nicely with Picard accusing Q of kind of doing the opposite, of simply accusing humanity of being bad because he doesn't understand them. after Picard seemingly gives Q the idea to have a trial for humanity, Q disappears. Looking back at this, I thought I didn't realize that Q's original goal wasn't to put humanity on trial. But by watching the episode, it seems to be the case that Q's original goal is to get humanity to stop exploring because they're a savage race. But I think the story actually would be much more interesting if Q had the idea to put humanity on trial from the beginning. After the Enterprise kind of escapes from Q's force field, Picard asks Troy what she thinks they just met. She says it's something much more advanced than humanity, or much more different than humanity. Now, Picard decides to separate the saucer section from the rest of the Enterprise, and we see that this Enterprise can do that, and the show thinks it's very cool getting shots of the Enterprise disconnecting with some music that tells us they think this is a really cool concept. What if the Enterprise separated? You know what? Fair enough. It is pretty cool. Then we of course see O'Brien for the first time, who's the best. Q puts Picard and other members of the crew into a trial during a time period called the post-atomic horror. Now, this is really cool because it's not every day that we get to see history in Star Trek that takes place in between our time and, like, the original series time, you know? So it's very cool for the nerdy boys like me to get this little piece of history that takes place in that time period. Now, I did a little research on the post-atomic horror, and apparently this was a time period when most of society had kind of collapsed due to World War III. Now, if you've seen the movie Wrath of Khan, which is a very good movie, you'll know that that World War III is also called the Eugenics War, or the Eugenics War possibly led into World War III. It's a little unclear. The post-atomic horror, was caused by World War III, so in a way, the post-atomic horror was Khan's fault. Khan! Now, Q comes out as the judge of this trial, assuring the crew that they won't be harmed until they're proven guilty. And Picard takes some time to once again reiterate how humanity looks back at their past and they're ashamed of it, but they moved on and they continue to move on. It's all great sort of philosophy stuff, and it again reinforces the idea that humanity can come together and become better because of it. So there's this scene where Q demands that Picard answers to the charges of being a grievously savage race, to which Picard sort of replies, he's like, I can't do that because that could mean anything. I'll need direct charges, which, by the way, I think is something that is important to do when you're in debate or arguing, is always make sure that you have the other person clarify their terms, because if they don't clarify their terms, you don't necessarily know what they're talking about. So it helps avoid misunderstanding, but also if you're arguing with someone who's not arguing in good faith, then it sort of takes away their ability to just change how they're defining words whenever they want, however they want. So, good job, Picard. Proud of you. And then Q kind of laughs at Picard, being like, oh, you're asking for full disclosure of human ugliness. You're asking to see all of these ugly things that humans have done that will just prove my point. So then Picard is handed this list of all of the crimes of humanity. Picard looks at this list and states, I see no charges against us. Now, the us here presumably means him and his crew, but also could likely mean something like humanity in the present day. Again, trying to go by this notion that this is an evolved and near perfect version of humanity. Now, at this point, Q threatens to kill the other members of the crew, which doesn't really make sense to me. I don't know why he did that, but that's how the episode was written. So at this point, Picard is pushed to shout out, "We agree that there is evidence that supports that humanity has been savage." But then he demands that Q test whether or not it is presently true of humans. Now, Q is seemingly delighted by the notion of testing humanity in the present day, which perhaps starts the fascination that Q has with the philosophical Captain Picard. But also, to me, it sort of makes sense that Q is just sort of delighted by this idea of, like, putting on a test for humanity. Q puts Picard and the crew back on the Enterprise, telling Picard he's not ready for the mission ahead. Now, this is a good way of sort of building suspense for the rest of the video. Like, oh, they aren't ready? I want to, keep watching and see that what they're not ready for. Now, at this point, we switch over to the perspective of William Riker, who is soon to be Picard's first officer on the Farpoint station. Now, I want to say, I think it was absolutely a brilliant idea, splitting the crew into two groups for this first episode. First, letting us fall in love with one group of characters without there being too many characters introduced at the same time, and then, as the story goes, bringing in more characters while still doing a pretty good job of giving most characters a fair amount of time. And we get to see Riker's perspective and wonder, how are the stories going to meet up? Riker goes to see the Farpoint administrator, a guy named Zorn, to see how the Farpoint station came together so quickly. Now, this Zorn guy offers Riker a piece of fruit, and Riker says he'll take an apple, but then sees there's no apples in the bowl of fruit, as we see a bowl of apples appear on the table where the bowl of fruit previously was. Now, I feel like this scene could have used a little more subtlety, maybe not making it so obvious that the apple bowl wasn't there before. So after Riker leaves, the administrator scolds someone for seemingly making the apples appear, saying whoever he's talking to is gonna arouse suspicion, and that they might have to punish him if he does it again. Again, I just feel like this scene could have benefited from more subtlety, not giving the audience information the crew doesn't have, so that the audience kind of gets to discover everything as the crew does. I think that could have made this story more enjoyable. We're then introduced to Wesley and Beverly Crusher, who are approached by Riker. Now, Riker tries to recruit Beverly into investigating the station, which either shows the character's investigative nature, or what was possibly the writer's intention, where it shows Riker's want to impress the new captain. Either way you choose to interpret it, it does say something about the character. Now, unfortunately, I don't think the writers really had a good grasp of who Beverly was at this point, which might possibly be a problem they had throughout the entire show. I never feel like Beverly is the most well-defined character in the show. LeVar Burton comes up to Riker and says that the Enterprise is coming without the saucer section, and that the captain wants him on board immediately. Now, there's kind of this weird scene where Riker gets after LeVar Burton for not being professional enough, which, to me, it just doesn't seem to be quite coherent with who Riker's character is. Because when I think of Riker, yes, he is, like, somewhat militaristic, but he's also this sort of, like, friendly, charming character that I think wouldn't have a problem with LeVar Burton coming to him more casually. Now, when Riker comes aboard the Enterprise, the captain seems very sort of cold to him, telling him that Riker will be brought up to date before the captain talks to him, which doesn't quite seem to fit with the Picard character to me. It seems just a little too cold and detached. And it does fit the more strict Captain Picard than I feel like the interaction with LeVar in the last scene, but I still can't help but feel like it could have been a little better written. It just doesn't quite add up as Captain Picard to me. Now, Riker has shown what Picard and the team have been up to thus far, and they do this thing that I kind of hate where they use just the footage from the episode as like security footage, and I always have to snicker to myself a little bit, being like, this security footage has very dynamic cinematography. Like this is a those cameras. But this one, it does, I can let it off the hook a little bit, where maybe there's these cameras on the bridge of the Enterprise that can sort of move around and zoom in because it's so far in the future. But I feel like this could have been shown much better with more different footage that looks more of like there was actually cameras somewhere else recording the event. And I also think it could have been done better with with a little bit of footage from Picard explaining some things here or there. But however, what they did achieve what they intended, I suppose, and that's showing that Riker basically knows everything that happened now. Now, when Riker goes to talk to Picard, he has him manually reattach both sides of the Enterprise. Now, I don't really know why Picard had Riker do this. I guess it was just like sort of a test to see if he was capable. And in my head, I remembered this scene happening where like Riker has like a little joystick that he uses to control one side of the Enterprise, interlocking it with the other. But I guess what actually happens is he just sort of tells the people at the front panels like where to fly and how much to turn, which I think is actually less cool than how I remembered it. Now, after both portions of the Enterprise are reattached, Riker goes to Worf asking him where he can find Data, and Worf tells him that Data is on this little mission transporting this admiral. And Riker is like, well, why couldn't the admiral just teleport from one ship to the other? And Worf replies with, the admiral is a very remarkable man, which is a good line as we switch to seeing Data walking with the admiral, who is revealed to be McCoy from the original series. So, yay, we love McCoy. McCoy is the best. Now, Riker and Picard are discussing what Riker saw on the planet, and this is when Riker sees Troy, and we get this indication that these two characters have a history, and this scene is like very good at just like creating this sort of uncomfortable atmosphere where like these two characters don't really know how to interact with each other, and you can tell that like there was sort of like they didn't necessarily separate on the best terms. They don't really know how to go about reconnecting. Now, Troy, Riker, and Picard go down to talk to Zorn, who says he gets paranoid by them having a Betazoid. Troy responds, oh, well, I'm only half Betazoid, so I can only actually sense like strong emotions. So then the administrator name drops the Ferengi, which at this point I guess are being set up to be like the main TNG villain. So Troy senses this emotion, which he describes as terrible loneliness and despair. So after Riker goes and meets Data on the holodeck, Riker, Tasha Yar, LeVar Burton, Troy, and Data all beam down to Farpoint Station. And Tasha begins by recommending they start by examining the underside of the station. And Troy suggests that maybe her and Riker could go down and examine the underground tunnels underneath the station. And I think this shows an implication that Troy sort of wants to communicate Riker in her past, right? And maybe by exploring these tunnels, that would give them a chance to, like, actually reconnect and talk about whatever happened. And then I think Riker is kind of scared of reconnecting with Troy. So he's like, oh, actually, everyone else will go with you and explore the underground tunnels, and me and Data will sort of look around above ground to see what we find. So Troy begins feeling like this despair. So then Riker and Data come down to where she is, and they're like, oh, well, where's the despair coming from? And she says it's a life form that isn't anything like them. And the thing that's weird about this line is that's very similar to how Troy previously regarded Q. So it sort of draws a connection between these two beings, which I think wasn't on purpose. And it sort of just feels like it's not as smooth of a story as it could have been because of, this and a couple other things. Picard sees Crusher, and I feel like the interaction between Picard and Crusher is just a lot like the interaction between Riker and Troy. It's like the only response that you can have to being reintroduced to a woman from your past is with, like, this discomfort and awkwardness. And I kind of wish that maybe Picard and Crusher would have had, like, a more mature reuniting. But that's not how it's written. This other spaceship comes and it starts firing on the planet where Farpoint Station is, but not on Farpoint Station itself. So this is, again, it's giving us a little hint of maybe what the Farpoint Station actually ends up being. And then Data and Riker decide just to take a nap in the wreckage. I don't know why they're taking a nap there. But joking aside, I feel like this scene is very awkward because the implication is that obviously, like, Data and Riker get knocked out by, like, the wreckage, or, like, you kind of just see them laying there. So it's where it's like it communicates what happened well enough, I think, at least by modern standards, is kind of like, okay, that could have been shown more clearly. So the administrator gets teleported away. Q starts taunting Picard, saying he's running out of time. And Troy starts to sense something different. She's sensing satisfaction. So Q, for some reason, he wants Riker to send a away team over to the spaceship that's firing down on the planet. And Picard is like, no, it's too risky. Riker comes up and he's like, no, actually, I want to go do that. Can I go do that, please? So then we have an interaction, Q, where he's like, oh, Riker, you have potential. And that's possibly foreshadowing the later episode where Q actually gives Riker the power to be a Q. And it kind of shows that, like, Q has a little bit of this liking for Riker. It sort of makes sense because I feel like Riker sort of has a little bit of a playful nature in keeping with Q's own playful nature. Riker takes the away team over to the other ship, and it's revealed that it looks the same as the underground tunnels underneath the Farpoint Station, which I really like. That's, again, it's giving the audience the puzzle pieces to figure out what the Farpoint Station is before it outright explains it to them. So then it's pretty soon after this that the crew kind of figures out that the spaceship's a giant jellyfish and the station's a giant jellyfish, and they're friends. So, like, the pieces just, like, sort of come together as the episode wraps up, and the Enterprise gives the Farpoint Station the energy it needs to revert back to being a giant jellyfish. At that point, turns to Q and is like, you're just using us as entertainment, get off the ship. And then Q's like, oh, well, I'm leaving now because the trial's over and you won. Congratulations, bye. Poof, he's gone. The show ends with Picard saying, let's see what's out there, and then delivering his signature, engage. So at the end of the day, what did I think of this episode? This episode has gotten a lot of hate, and I can understand why. But I think this episode also has very good elements that I appreciate a lot. For example, starting by the concept of putting humanity on trial, I think is very fitting with the tone of the show that is coming up and the philosophical nature of it all. So I like most of that. However, I'm not a big fan of the jellyfish storyline. There is parts of it I like. I like the idea of like having this, finding this alien creature, and then they sort of force it to make stuff for them and be their like little station. I think that's sort of cool. And I even like the other jellyfish being its buddy who's like coming to save it. I like that quite a lot as well. However, what I don't care for so much is how the jellyfish storyline connects with the Q storyline, or more so how it doesn't. It's weird how they experience this near godlike being that is Q, and then they're so amazed when they see this jellyfish creature who, turns energy into matter, when they see a creature that is Q that can do so much more than the jellyfish creature can do. It's kind of strange. I also feel like for the Q story, it would make more sense for the Enterprise to be in more of a moral situation, and less of just like a investigate what's going on situation. Maybe something like a trolley problem where neither answer is very morally correct, and then in the end, Picard finds some way to make a good decision, proving that humanity is capable of great good. But that's not what we have, so I kind of think there's a lot of ideas in this episode that just don't quite work together. Also, I mentioned previously on how it's weird the similarities between the Q and the jellyfish creature that are never really acknowledged by the script, so that makes it kind of weird. And it's also a first episode, so lots of the characters haven't quite been figured out yet. Lots of the acting is kind of weird as the actors don't know who the characters are. I will say I think Patrick Stewart right off the bat does a good job acting. However, I don't feel like the captain was written very good in this episode. I kind of feel like Patrick Stewart knew who the captain was long before the writers of the show ever did. And like I previously mentioned a few times, I don't really feel like they knew who like Beverly Crusher was. Though I feel like a character like Data, I feel like Data's pretty spot on in how he's interpreted throughout the rest of the show, really. So overall, what I want to say is I think the episode is actually really good. It shows a lot of potential for the rest of the show, which is what you want to do in a pilot like this. I just also think the script may have benefited from a few rewrites. But what do you think? Do you have any disagreements with me? Is there anything that I liked that you didn't like in this episode? I would love to hear about it in the comment section. And of course, if this video does well, it gets a lot of views, a lot of likes, I'll be happy to keep making more sort of video essays like this. Maybe we could dabble into one of my other favorite shows, Doctor Who, or other shows like that. I had quite a bit of fun reviewing this episode. So, by all means, like this video, share it with your Trekkie nerd friends, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!